So, Ambassador, my good friend, I'm going to ask you this right at the top. I don't want to turn this into a partisan beatdown because there are serious questions here about the future, the state of the world and the state of our democracy and some of the programs that you've worked on and I've worked on and what the future looks like. But before we get to them, this issue is so much in the news, I have to ask you because you have a particular expertise. We had this extraordinary story yesterday about a call on Signal, a chat, leading up to an invasion, not invasion, but an attack on the Houthis in Yemen to try and protect waterways in the region from their attacks. And it turns out that the whole strategy, including war plans, were apparently discussed on this. And the reason we know this is because, for reasons no one yet has explained, a reporter was included in the manifest of this call, of this Signal chat. Like, what?
Yeah.
So tell me why this seems so improbable.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. David, thank you for doing this. I mean, I've never, ever seen anything like this. And it's so extraordinary for so many reasons. So if I can just sort of back up and put this in perspective. So as National Security Advisor, 3-4 times a week, I would convene meetings of the National Security Principals Committee These are the cabinet level secretaries of all of the key national security agencies. So Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA. Sometimes the Vice President would be present. Sometimes a representative from the Chief of Staff or the Chief of Staff himself or herself would be present. This group would gather, always in a classified setting, always even the topics of the meetings that we were having and the fact that we were meeting on a given topic was itself classified. We would meet in the White House Situation Room, which is a highly secure facility in the basement of the White House where you cannot bring your cell phones, you cannot bring your Apple Watches. The reason for that is because cell phones and Apple Watches can be infiltrated and used by our adversaries as listening devices. So if they're in the room with you, they can hear the whole discussion. So we would convene these meetings in the Situation Room. And if a member of the Principals Committee was out of town or traveling or not available, they could join the meeting, as I often did from New York as UN ambassador, by secure video conference. Or if that doesn't work, by secure phone. And the cabinet level secretaries and the National Security Advisor, everywhere they go in the US or the world, they travel with a small team of people who are their communicators. These are people who are expert in secure communications, and they set up the secure phone and the secure video, and they do it in a tent if need be, which can't be infiltrated. And when you're in Moscow, you're in a tent set up in your hotel that is configured to block intercept signals, or you go to the embassy and you sit in a secure facility inside the embassy and join via video teleconference. There is no reason why a sensitive meeting of the Principals Committee needs be or should be conducted on a commercial chat app, whether Signal, which is encrypted but at a commercial level, not at a national security level, or anything else. They have secure phones, they have secure devices that keep them connected. So, first of all, the fact that there is a principals committee meeting on a very serious subject, whether to engage in military operations, and rather than sit down and have a very thoughtful, deliberate conversation that likely extends for hours, where you consider, is this the right time? Is this the right operation? Do we have the right targets? What are the regional security ramifications? What are the diplomatic implications? Have we consulted with our allies? Do we have a communications plan to roll this out? All of these are things that we always normally consider very carefully when we're engaged in a military operation. And we take hours to go through the planning and consideration of that. You don't get on a Signal chat with emojis and make those kinds of decisions. There was nothing thoughtful or deliberative about what's been reported. So the idea that you would, one, conduct a principals meeting on something so serious via text chat, as opposed to a sit-down serious meeting or two or three, is itself insane.
Did that make your emoji's head explode?
That you would talk about something that is classified on a commercial app on your personal cell phones, because you're not allowed to put them on your government phones. So these people are using their personal cell phones for a discussion about something highly classified. Now they're saying, well, there was nothing classified. Let me explain something to you. The fact that there was a principals meeting is classified. The fact that they were discussing military operations is classified inherently. Why? Common sense. If it weren't, the people who you are attacking might find out ahead of time that you're going to attack them. That would be bad.
I mentioned to you earlier that the guy who really must feel uncomfortable is the chief of security in Iran, who missed the opportunity to steal the war plans.
But the Russians didn't miss the opportunity. And Witkoff is in Moscow on his personal phone, not in a skiff, part of this communication. They've got it hook, line, and sinker. So every aspect of this was just whack, to put it politely. And guess who apparently wasn't in this conversation? If the reporting is correct about who was on this chat and who was in the conversation, conspicuously absent two people. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the acting chairman, whose job it is to provide military advice to the president, and the CENTCOM commander, the operational commander for the Central Command region of the Middle East, that was the guy that was actually executing the operation. Why were they not in this meeting? Well, for one thing, if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I am confident, I don't even have a personal relationship with this person. There's no person who could be chairman of the Joint Chiefs who does not know that you do not talk about military plans on a Signal app. But apparently everybody else either didn't know, didn't care.
Including the Secretary of Defense.
Including the Secretary of Defense, who put, now to add to it, apparently the sensitive details of the war plan, or war plan is a term of art, op plan, con op, on the Signal chat. So when Hegseth said, I didn't put the war plan on there, that's a trick, y'all. He's using a term of art. Chris is back there nodding his head. A war plan and an op plan and a con op are not all the same thing. But he put the targets, the timing, the sequencing, the ordnance.
Yeah, it seems important.
I mean, I'm just like, I want to hit my...
Yeah.
But if I'd done that, it would have been
Yes.
a bit of a...
Well, and I would like to believe that that people, Jeff Flake served in the United States Senate. I think that people of both parties, regardless of who the president is, should be concerned about that and want to know more about how it happened. It's disturbing to think that might not happen, because every single one of them knows better than that. But anyway, I'm glad we cleared that up.
I could keep going, but
No,
let's move on.
I know you could. I know you could. Listen, Pat talked about your unique background. You're kind of a unicorn. I can't think of anybody else who's had the senior national security positions that you've held, and then turned around and was the director of the Domestic Policy Council. So I want to talk about both But since you've spent most of your, well, let me ask you this question in the first place. What drew you to national security and foreign policy in the first place? You started right out of, this was where you started in the beginning. I think you were a foreign policy advisor to Mike Dukakis when he ran for president, or you contributed to that.
It's like a junior.
All right, I'm trying to inflate but play along with me
22,
here.
yeah.
Well, but 4 years later, you were very much, you were at the Brookings Institute, and then you ended up in the administration and so on. So tell me what drew you to foreign policy in the first place.
Well, it's interesting. Background, I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Grew up in an environment where many people were involved in policy and politics and diplomacy. When I was a high school student, I was fortunate to get to spend all 4 of my summers during high school working on Capitol Hill as a page, as an intern. And in that time of my life, my focus was very much domestic. I worked for some of you may recall Congressman Augustus Hawkins, who was longtime chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. That was where my focus was. And then I went to university at Stanford. I was a history major, and my expectation and interest was that I would go to law school eventually and do some kind of public interest law, civil rights law, poverty law, something that would, be related to the issues and challenges of people who hadn't had the privilege that I was fortunate to have growing up. Then, while I was a senior in college, I got a scholarship, the Rhodes Scholarship, that enabled me to go to Oxford University in England and study for 2 or 3 years. And I thought it would be ideal to use that time while I was overseas to study something that I hadn't spent any time on, to broaden my interests and knowledge. So I did a master's and then ultimately a doctorate in international relations. But all the while, my expectation was I'd come back, I'd go to law school and go into this whole domestic path. Always interested in policy, always interested in government. And when I was young, like 10 or 11 or 12, I thought, wow, it'd be really cool to be a United States senator. That was really my ambition.
But then, Jeff, she grew up.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, 2 things. I was from Washington, D.C., which I still am, which it has no voting rights in Congress, so that's a bit of a problem. But the other was, that I went on to different things. But it was that time getting my doctorate in international relations that got me more and more interested in that set of issues.
We should point out parenthetically, your mom was a force in education policy and really was the mother of, as it were, the Pell Grant program. Your father, yeah, that's.
My mom's up there thanking you all for the.
And your dad was an economist.
My dad was an economist and a Federal Reserve Board governor.
Yes, yeah. So you had that background. So anyway, but you were drawn.
I was drawn to the international. I worked on this Dukakis campaign as a junior foreign policy aide, and then when President Clinton was elected, I actually got 2 job offers to join the White House in the Clinton administration. I'm 28 years old, but because I'd worked on the prior 4 years ago campaign, there were people with Bill Clinton that found me when I was a consultant, a management consultant up in Canada, and asked me to come and interview for 2 different jobs. One on the National Economic Council with Bob Rubin, and the other on the National Security Council with Tony Lake. And I kind of went eeny, meeny, miny, mo, because I didn't really know what to do. And something sort of said to me, do the national security piece, because it's probably harder to get into the national security realm and learn that stuff. And if you don't like it, you can probably transition to the domestic. But it may be harder to do domestic to international. I had no basis for that. That was just sort of intuitive. So I said yes. And I started on the National Security Council staff at age 28 as the director level, that's the expert level, low level policy person responsible for the United Nations and peacekeeping. And then in 2 years, I was promoted to be the senior director, that's when you run a small office on the National Security Council staff, responsible for Africa. And then in President Clinton's second term, when he was reelected and Madeleine Albright was made Secretary of State, I was asked to go to the State Department and became the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And that's how sort of one thing led to another, and then UN and then National Security Advisor under Obama. So I'd spent most of my career on the international side. And when President Biden was elected, he's like, I want you to come back. I want you to serve. And how would you like to do domestic policy? I want you to bring the skills and the organizing experience and the sort of the bureaucratic chops that he'd seen me utilize as National Security Advisor to the domestic policy side, which has historically been somewhat less structured in how decisions are made. And I said, great. And it was a chance to kind of get back to some of the issues that I've always cared about, been passionate about, but never really had the chance to work on. So, I loved it.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to deal with Putin or Xi or Mohammed bin Salman or others I won't name.
Yeah, you probably found a few people in Washington who were difficult to deal with too, but just on the international side, there were certain values that animated the administrations you worked in. There are certain values that animated you, and describe them. Describe what you saw as the objective of American foreign policy and what sort of the major tools of it were, because it feels like we've made a kind of a sea shift in how we approach this now. And so I want you to talk a little bit about how you saw it.
I have always thought of myself as being in what was until recently the mainstream of foreign policy and national security decision making. I mean, there's a saying that I like to recall, which is frankly no longer true, but that for most of my career, foreign policy and national security was sort of played within the 40-yard lines, whether you were in a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. There was a middle path, and that middle path was your job is to protect, defend, and advance the national security interests of the United States and its people, consistent with the Constitution and the rule of law. That, that entails exercising power, not just through military means, not just through economic means, but through diplomacy, through development, through our public communications. And that the thing that has made the United States great and strong over many decades, since the end of World War II, was our system of alliances and partnerships. That we were stronger and more able to advance and secure our interests when we were working with partners that shared our values. And those values...
Bunch of nostalgic people.
Those values were imperfectly adhered to put it mildly, but they were a belief in the fundamentals of democracy, of freedom, of human rights, respect for the rule of law. Now, did administrations I worked in and others that I didn't fail to meet those standards at every time? Were there many times when there's a direct conflict between our values and our interests and our security? Yes, and you have to manage that. But the bottom line was we were trying to be, on a bipartisan basis, a leader in the world that stood strong and stood for certain principles and stood with like-minded allies and partners.
And we've seen in the last really 8 weeks, I guess it is now, the dissolution of several elements of that, and foreign aid, for one. And, if you ask people about foreign aid in this country, they would say that's about 30% of the budget. It's really 1%, less than 1%. But it's been sort of wiped out to a large degree in a Muskian swoop. What is the impact? That is a tool that no longer exists for American policymakers. What is the impact of that? I'm not talking about the humanitarian impact, which is, I know that's an essential part of it, but as a strategic matter.
Yeah. Well, the two places on the planet where dance parties were held when we killed USAID were Moscow and Beijing, because they are the places that have most found problematic our reach, our ability to advance democracies, support the values that I've described, which they find antithetical, to gain the goodwill and the support of countries around the world. What did USAID do? USAID did everything from democracy promotion, support for civil society, for human rights organizations, to establishing a global health security network where we could detect and test for emergent diseases, get the DNA sequences, bring them back, and make preventative vaccines that can protect Americans and people around the world. We have gone dark. We no longer have any real global health security surveillance, so we're worried about the next bird flu pandemic or the next COVID or the next Ebola. We're blind now. We've pulled out of the World Health Organization. We can't even send emails to communicate with the World Health Organization. USAID provides life-saving food aid, or did provide life-saving food aid all over the world. Who benefits from that? Well, the people who are not starving as a result. But the other major beneficiaries are American farmers all over this country who rely on the purchase by USAID of their produce. And I could go on, but it was a surrender of our leadership, our influence to Moscow and Beijing that will result in the deaths of millions and millions and millions of people around the world.
And to the extent that any vacuum is filled in, China's probably poised to provide it.
They're already.
A less noted development, but related to it, was the
VOA?
Voice of America, yes.
Same.
Under the brief but eventful leadership of Carrie Lake. It is now.
She never even got the job, y'all. And she sent the email firing everybody. That itself is.
After saying that she wanted to, build the organization.
She and Rick Grinnell really got the short end of the stick in this administration.
What are you talking about? He's running the Kennedy Center now. He gets to. So, and then alliances. You talked about the value of alliances as a predicate for, effective national security. There's a different attitude about alliances, and you saw it reflected in that chat. The vice president referring to Europeans as freeloaders, and I'm sure that was well received in capitals around the world. But talk about how alliances, because there may be Americans and there may be people in this room who say, why do we have to support the defense of these countries, and why are they taking advantage of us in trade and so on? So I'm teeing you up, but go ahead.
Well, first of all, alliances are a mutual commitment to come to one another's defense when attacked. The only time Article 5, which is the mechanism within NATO that commits the alliance to respond when one of its members is attacked, was ever invoked was after 9/11, when we were attacked. And the alliance came to our defense, and they stood with us, and they, for years and years, were by our side in Afghanistan as we were fighting al-Qaeda and the Taliban. That's the only time. And the notion that we are doing the Europeans a favor by strengthening and maintaining NATO, by having a mutual security guarantee, is false on its face. It is in our interest that countries that share our values and that are partners with us are, as one, able to stand up and make it very clear that there is a line across which Putin and Russia must not cross. And the reason why, it's so, everybody has got not everybody, some people have got the Ukraine thing wrong is the Ukrainians, the reason why Russia is so upset about Ukraine is because they were afraid that Ukraine might join NATO and the European Union. They know that once Ukraine is in NATO, they can't mess with Ukraine anymore because they know better than to cross that line. But now, we've supported Ukraine, we, the United States, we, Europe and Canada, more than the United States in dollar terms, by the way, have supported Ukraine because Ukrainians are standing up and fighting Russia themselves. They are doing the fighting and dying for their own land, which is as it should be. But they're doing it in part to our benefit, because if the message to Russia is you can invade your neighbors and nobody's going to stop you. But remember what Russia's done. Started in 2008. They invaded Georgia and took a piece of Georgia. In 2014, they invaded Crimea in eastern Ukraine and took it and stayed. And in 2022, they tried to take all of Ukraine. Remember going to Kyiv, and they have been pushed back, and they will not succeed in taking all of Ukraine. But if they think they can take Ukraine, then it's the Baltics next, it's Poland, it's on, and then you are at war with the United States and NATO. And deterrence, which has been the thing that has kept us all safe since the end of World War II, is dependent on the perception and the reality that the United States and Europe and Canada stand together against Russia and, if need be, ultimately, potentially against China.
But obviously, you can see the conversation among European leaders about the need to make other arrangements because there is a concern that the president under this administration will not. And my question is, by the way, the president who said when Putin invaded,
was very smart.
that he said it was a genius. If you could take this territory, why wouldn't you? And he has articulated really a great powers kind of view of the thing, that he and Xi and Putin will sit down and work all these issues.
Divide the world into spoils.
Through. What are the, and it does cast doubt on the efficacy of these global institutions that were built up after World War II to try and prevent global wars. What are the implications for the future of a kind of great powers approach?
Well, it's worse than that. It's not just that we're back to the 19th century where big powers are dividing up the map, okay? We're in a situation, to put it very bluntly, where the President of the United States has decided that he is not interested in maintaining our alliances and partnerships. He is not only, calling into question our commitment to Europe and Ukraine, he's starting trade wars with our closest partners. He's threatening the territorial integrity of Canada. And that's not a joke, it's serious. He's now threatening Greenland and sending J.D. Vance over there and Mike Waltz this week to just against the will of the Greenlanders and the Denmark government. He's starting conflict with our allies, and at the same time aligning us with and capitulating to Putin. And Xi, by the way, because China and Russia are allies. They are in lockstep. And all these things we've talked about, the tariffs, the weakening of NATO, eradication of USAID, the eradication of the Voice of America and all of the Radio Free Europe and Radio Marti for Cuba, all of that, along with a commitment to cut 8% from the Defense Department every year, it's huge cuts. The decision to halt offensive cyber operations against Russia when Russia and Russian elements are every day attacking our critical infrastructure, our hospitals, your pocketbooks. Everything he is doing is to decimate our alliances and partnerships, our global leadership, and hand our interests to Russia and China on a silver platter. And we all should be asking ourselves why. It's that deadly serious. So forget the great power thing. I mean, in the great power thing, what do we have left? We have basically the Western Hemisphere. We've given up Europe, given up Asia. That makes no sense. There's something more going on than great power competition and a return to the 19th century. This is a massive ceding of our leadership and our
So the
standing
question
in the
is,
world.
Donald Trump's not going to be president forever. That's not meant as an applause line. And he may disagree. But can you put the
Genie back in the bottle.
genie back in the bottle?
I'm really worried that it will be extremely difficult. I don't want to say impossible. Extremely difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. It was bad enough after Trump's first term when, he basically went to the dinner party and pulled the, what do you call it? The tablecloth, thank you, out from under the table, and all the cutlery and all the glassware and the plates went flying in the air. But then along comes Joe Biden, traditional in the 40-yard lines kind of guy, back to our alliances, back to our partnerships. That was an aberration. Really sorry. Won't happen again. Didn't mean it. We'll be all right. Everybody as you were. And then we elect Trump again. And Trump is, a whole supercharged version of what we saw in the first term. He's got a different agenda. We weren't talking about invading Canada and Panama in Trump 1, right? There's a whole lot more going on there than was the case before. And our allies are just like, even if Trump is not reelected, they can't be on this yo-yo. Mm-hmm. It's just not sustainable. They've got to worry about themselves.
One of the interesting things that I'm watching is how the politics of these countries are being impacted by this, because in Canada, the Liberal Party of Trudeau was dead. And it looked like they were headed for a historic defeat. Since this started, since we started trying to seed them and make them the 51st state, and by the way, I keep reminding my Republican friends how many electoral votes Canada would have if they joined the U.S., but
they know it. They don't like it either.
But the Liberal Party now there's a new prime minister, Mark Carney. He called a snap election. It is a very close election up there because the number one issue, which had been inflation, is now who can resist the coercion of Trump. So, and I'm wondering, Keir Starmer has taken a different approach to talking with Trump, but he's also talking about European independence around defense issues and building up European capacities and so on, and British capacities. And his numbers have improved. And the question is whether there's a sort of a backlash globally and will there be a resistance to right-wing populist, the right-wing populist movement because of a reaction to Trump?
I think it's way too early to tell. And I don't think, even if Carney wins in Canada, which I think is, it's a jump ball right now.
Right.
I don't think that necessarily heralds the end of populist nationalism. Senator Flake is also Ambassador Flake. He was ambassador to Turkey we're seeing Erdogan like go hog wild, arresting the mayor of Istanbul, who is a
His
political
opponent,
rival.
yeah.
There are plenty of people around the world who, feel like it's, open season on democracy and political opponents.
Yeah,
And
well,
by the way, we got to come to democracy in this country.
yeah, well, I'm about to make the pivot, but thanks
Okay.
for the reminder. Because one of the things that I kept saying during the campaign was, if you want to understand where this could go to Hungary, go to Turkey. But Trump as a candidate kept heralding Orban of Hungary as a kind of role model, and he's been honored by CPAC and others here. And he has, over a period of time, converted Hungary into a democracy sort of in form only, but in many of the same ways that we're now that we're seeing. So talk to me about you're an observer of democracy around the world. What are the elements that you see now that concern you here at home?
All right, finally, thank you.
I'm slow, but I pick up on the cues.
Well, let me just say what concerns me greatly here at home, but it is, to put it simply and answer your question, very much the playbook that authoritarians have used around the world. There's so many elements to this, but the intimidation of the media, the intimidation of the private sector, and the expectation that you either conform or you face some sort of penalty from. And
we should point out, if you don't mind me just interrupting here, this is the meaning of independent agencies, of inspectors general, of a Justice Department that is not a political organ of the White House, because there's so much power invested in these agencies and in the Justice Department and so on, that if you have business interests that can be impacted by those things. We now see law firms.
Oh my goodness, the law firms are a whole other thing.
Who are being cited in executive orders, and that essentially would shut these law firms down if they engage in lawsuits that the president.
If they represent people the president doesn't like. Our whole system of law is an adversarial system where everybody has the right to counsel. And part of what is happening is the president is trying to intimidate law firms and starve law firms so that they do not provide counsel to people that he does, who might oppose him. That is Orwellian. What he is doing to higher education, and not just higher education, but education from pre-K on up, is to disempower those that are giving our young people the wherewithal to think freely, think critically, and learn. He's erasing history. Black history, women's history, the history of everybody in this country that isn't a white, male, Christian, straight
We should point out your dad was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen.
He was Tuskegee Airmen. Yeah. They're gone. Poor Jackie Robinson almost didn't make it.
Yes.
But anyway, this is all, eliminating the Department of Education. That is about ensuring that poor kids don't get well educated. That's about taking us back to a time.
I have a child with special needs, so she was the beneficiary of the assistance and aid that the law provided that was administered through
by the Department.
The question is, the administration says these monies will still be expended, the services will still be provided. I see you smiling.
We'll go back to the states.
No,
remember that time?
But they say other federal agencies will send these monies to the states.
Yeah, wait till the Small Business Administration is administering your student loans. See how that goes. It was bad enough when the Department of Education was doing it. So anyway, there are so many. Then there's the whole dismantling of the federal government. Lock and stock. When you try to
including these agencies that are supposed to take on new responsibility.
Exactly. I mean, there is a systematic dismantling of the pillars of our democracy underway. And we are, check your watches, going after judges, disappearing people off the streets of our country under the suspicion or the allegation that they are not only here illegally, but they are criminals without any validation. Their people have been disappeared to El Salvador for having tattoos. And if you don't have due process, if you don't have the opportunity to have an individual hearing, then David, you or I or anybody in this room can be picked up off the street, accused of being an alien and a criminal, and sent to God knows where, without any record, without any legal hearing. We're in a different.
I think by the end of this, you and I may be at the top of the list.
Well, I'm already high on the list, so they know where to find me.
But let me just raise an issue with you that I think about a lot, because the question is, you say, and yet we elected Donald Trump again. There is a considerable backlash to government. There is, and it's not just here. It's this is sort of an issue in Europe and elsewhere. But we did a poll. I started an Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and in 2022 we did a poll, and it was around a conference on disinformation. And I threw some agree-disagree questions in there, and one of them was the government is corrupt and rigged against people like me. 56% of Americans agreed with that statement. And it wasn't just, MAGA Republicans. There were people on the left who believed the same. We've gone through a period of enormous change and upheaval because of technology that has created tremendous capacity, lots of wealth, and has also left a whole bunch of people behind and working harder. And because you've tried to address those things through some of the programs that you were working on. But there is a systemic issue, and the question is, I always said during the campaign, people are talking about democracy over the kitchen table, and I was. They probably didn't have to worry about the cost of the food on their kitchen table. If they had to worry about the cost of the food on their kitchen table, that's what they were talking about. And so I worry a little bit. All of the things you say are true. I'm deeply concerned about it. But it's also important to talk to people about the things that are closest to their lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you asked me a question about the dismantling of our democracy. And
you told me to.
Yes, I did. And I answered that, but I could keep going, but I won't. But it doesn't mean that that's the only issue that people care about. But let's talk about the dismantling of the federal government.
Yeah.
We're talking about services and resources that people rely on. The ability to get the Social Security Administration to answer your call.
You probably read the Washington Post today on the Social Security Administration.
Wait till Medicaid is not available and rural hospitals start to go under. What is happening at the VA? People are not being able to get their veteran services. These are things that affect real people in their lives and in their pocketbooks.
Yeah.
And absolutely all of that is vitally important.
I would say two things. One is that waste, fraud, and abuse, and there's plenty in the federal government, as there is any large entity, is an appealing notion to people at 20,000 feet. When things start getting branded waste, fraud, and abuse, like the Social Security office that you rely on to go and deal with your issues, veterans help, and so on, it becomes an entirely different thing. And I do think that has political power. Certainly when they get to when they get to the tax bill and Medicaid, they cut Medicaid by $880 billion as the House has prescribed. That's not all going to be waste, fraud, and abuse. That's going to be service. That's very powerful. What I'm saying is there also needs to be a recognition that over a long period of time, through globalization, the effects of globalization, automation, the war, which you opposed from the very beginning in Iraq, which I think has contributed greatly to people's sense of isolationism and so on. The financial crisis, you and I were both in the White House, or you were in New York, but I was in the White House when the financial crisis was going on, and it decimated so many people in this country, and then the pandemic. And so there's reasons for people to be jaundiced, and maybe there's an opportunity. I mean, Trump is doing a tear down that's going to be very painful. Maybe there's an opportunity to envision a better and more effective way in the 21st century to achieve the goals that people like you and I and maybe others in this room believe are important.
Well, first of all, it would be great to have a successful, methodical review of government actions, government programs. We did that once. Some of us are old enough to remember when
Just looking around the room, there may be a few of those. I don't know.
And Al Gore, under President Clinton, did a whole reinventing government initiative, which saved billions and billions of dollars, cut the federal workforce by hundreds of thousands. But he did it slowly and methodically in conjunction with the agencies to make sure that you didn't, when you did it, you got the weeds, but you didn't, bring up all the branches. That's not how they're doing this.
No, of course not. No.
They don't have an interest in doing it this way because, frankly, this is not about waste, fraud, and abuse, everybody. That's not what this is. This is about systematically dismantling the apparatus of government that serves regular people and putting the wealth and the power in the hands of a few. Now, I'm not down with Bernie and AOC and everything they say and do. That's not sort of my part of the party. But they're telling a story that is actually real. This is about, let me back up. Why do y'all think Elon Musk is going through all the agencies and vacuuming up our personal identifying data? Why? That's not about waste, fraud, and abuse. Why does he want it? Artificial intelligence, y'all. Data is gold. He has a company called Grok, which is part of X. He wants to defeat OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, all of these companies, and be the one that becomes the leader in artificial intelligence as we get towards artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. There is nothing about what they are doing regarding waste, fraud, and abuse that requires that kind of data. And you look, we're already seeing it, firing people at the FAA, getting rid of a contract that was going to, was it Verizon or somebody, and giving it to Starlink. That's a Musk satellite company. There were billions of dollars going out the door as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation for rural broadband, laying down the broadband cable to take it to the parts of this country that don't have it. That is being killed, and the deal is being given to Starlink, which isn't as reliable a system, by the way, for rural broadband. There is a pattern here. It is about, in part, not entirely, it's about corruption. It's about lining the pockets of a small number of billionaires that have paid to play with Donald Trump.
The question is, will he in any way pay off for people in their own lives to a degree that they will accept that as the cost of of progress. I mean, that's what they're,
I,
and the sort of deflection of some of these other issues. I mean, there is, the issue of immigration was one of, the border was one of great concern. Was it a mistake not to move more aggressively on the border sooner than President Biden did?
I think so. And I was inside at the time arguing that we need to be tougher. But tougher within the rule of law. And tougher without separating children from their parents. Tougher without penalizing unaccompanied children. You know, and President Biden did it. Later, it was
3
last
years in,
year, and he put in place what was considered at the time a highly draconian executive order that drastically limited one's ability to apply for asylum. The numbers went way down, and they've continued to go down.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I personally, I come from a national security background. I believe in the rule of law. I'm a granddaughter of immigrants to this country. I believe we've got to have, open channels of legal immigration, that we are a nation of immigrants in addition to Native Americans and people who were brought here on slave ships. But, we can't have, a border that is not as secure as we can make it. But that doesn't mean we have to deport millions of people with no due process and send them to a gulag in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, Trump is taking a sentiment that was, in fairness, broadly shared and turning it into a crazy weapon to change the character and complexion of this country.
Or to change certainly in the short term, to change the political discussion, because that is a thing, that is a shiny object that I think attracts a lot of attention. If you are going to have a fight over presidential authority, as he presents it, a fight over whether you're going to deport 300 what he calls violent gang members is the turf on which you want to fight. And
I do. No, I want to, first of all, I don't think we fight on one piece and not another. This thing about deporting people without due process is truly, we need to understand, a problem for all of us. Because they don't have to demonstrate that the people they put on these planes are, first of all, not here legally, secondly, have any criminal record, and thirdly, are due to be deported. That is what immigration courts are for. That's what due process and hearings are for.
I'm not arguing the substance of it.
But
I'm talking politics and you're talking policy.
But I'm talking, it's not just policy. It's the rule of law.
No, I understand. I understand.
Wait till, if this keeps going, you're gonna have DACA kids on this campus being rounded up by ICE and sent out of the country. We're already having legal permanent residents denied entry and sent out of the country. Today there's an article in the Washington Post. The Trump administration wants every university to send them the names and the nationalities of people who might have participated in protests against what's happening in Gaza. This is Gestapo stuff, you guys. And until, if we don't stand up and say what it is and fight it, it's going to come for not just those people who are not here with documents, and not just those undocumented who may have committed violent crimes. There is no basis for determining who is and who isn't liable for deportation. And that, if you walk around looking like me, that's not a joke.
Presumably, the courts will ultimately rule on all of these matters. One of the things that's happened is the president has put a target on the back of the judge who's handling that particular immigration
and other
case,
judges, and
was rebuked by the Chief Justice for it. So if you believe in the rule of law, you have to put put some faith in the courts to do something about it. But the problem is that doesn't help the person who was falsely shipped to El
Disappeared,
Salvador.
yeah.
Yeah. So you say that that you have to fight these things. Tell me what your plans are.
I'm doing all I can, publicly and privately, to speak out and demand that this is not who we are, not who we can be. And I do this as somebody who's already on Kash Patel's enemies list, already somebody who Donald Trump accused in 2017 of being a criminal. So, people have to have the courage of their convictions. And we, all of us, together, have voices, have votes, have power if we use it. But if we all just sit back and, many people are scared, David.
Yes, I know.
Many people are, let it be somebody else's fight. Oh, they're not coming for me, they're coming for the other guys. They're coming for the gay people, they're coming for the black people, they're coming for the Latino people, they're coming for the Jews, whatever it is.
Or Susan, they're not thinking about that because they're thinking about the day-to-day issues in their lives.
They're not mutually exclusive.
No, they're not.
They're
not. But one thing I'm aware of is that you and I, and perhaps a lot of people in this room, have the privilege of focusing on these issues because we're not struggling with other issues. So the ability, you do have to do
David,
these two things at once.
I'm sorry, but if you're a Latino family on the other side of town, and you're busting your ass, and you're trying to educate your kids, and you're working, for minimum wage, you can be worried about what's coming on your breakfast table the next day, and also be worried that your grandmother's going to get deported. These are not mutually exclusive.
No, they're not.
The people who are suffering most
I agree.
don't have the luxury of worrying about only one thing.
I would point out to you that I agree, but there's a reason why the greatest drop-off for the Democratic ticket was among the Hispanic voters, and that a majority of men in the Hispanic community voted for Trump. So,
But they might be
I'm
asking
thinking like
themselves whether that was a great idea in retrospect.
Well, we'll see. It's not evident. It's not evident in polling right now because I think people are still hoping, waiting for improvement in their lives. And I will say this: I'm coming across like a political hack, which I am. But I will tell you that one of the benefits that Trump has in the early going here is he's made an invidious comparison with Biden, and there was a sense that there was relative ineffectuality, that the world was out of control. He wasn't in command. He wasn't active. He's not doing things. Trump is a whirlwind of activity. Now, eventually, the dust is going to settle, and people are going to say, "Wait, did this help me or hurt me?" And when that does, I think it becomes problematical, and it's going to be an issue that he's going to have to contend with in a midterm election, which may be the most consequential in the history of the country. But I share all of your sentiments, and I'm probably on many of the same lists as you. But all right, maybe you earned a higher spot, but I'm out there all the time in a very public way. But I also really, really try and focus on the experience of people in their daily lives, and I think it's important to do that because in many ways, the thing you don't, and you haven't here, the thing that I think Democrats should not want to do is become the tribunes of the status quo. Because the status quo has failed a lot of people.
I totally agree with that, David. And I totally agree that not just Democrats, all of us ought to be concerned about the basic economic and human concerns of people who are suffering. But all I'm saying is, it's if you are anything other than a well-to-do white Christian straight man in this country, all these other things are indivisible from your basic well-being. Because whether it's not educating your kids, whether it's taking away your Social Security benefits or your Medicaid, not everybody is, Lutnick's mother-in-law living in, in his billionaire mansion, not worrying whether her Social Security check comes. Most people who are on Social Security need their Social Security checks. And so all I'm saying is there's a bit of a luxury to sitting around and saying, well, we got to worry about the economic issues. We're not addressing it. Of course we got to address the economic issues. Everybody has economic issues except for a relative few, of which I'm one, okay? And you are too. But everybody else does. But everybody else also has to worry about, some of these other things that are really coming at us that are part of the dismantling of our democracy.
Yeah. I'm.
If you're, one other example, police brutality. We've forgotten to talk about that. We don't do it anymore.
I'm sorry, about what?
Police brutality. If you're a person of color walking down the street in many neighborhoods, you're not only worried about whether you get to your job safely, you might worry about whether you get to your job safely, and not just earn your paycheck, but get there physically safely. If you're a student in a school, you got to worry about, am I going to get through my school day without getting shot? There are a whole lot of other issues out there that do matter to people.
Yes.
And our job is to speak to all of them and to deliver on all of them. And government has not succeeded in doing that. There is an opportunity, to figure out how we rebuild Phoenix from the ashes when they burn down the entirety of the U.S. government, because we're not going to replace it as it was. You start from a white piece of paper, and the smart people, the successful people politically are going to be the ones that have a vision for how to do that better. I agree with all of that. But in the meantime, I don't think there is a dichotomy between worrying about the erosion and dismantling of our democracy and worrying about the kitchen table issues that matter to most Americans.
I agree. Well, listen, I'm the son of a refugee, okay? So I'm thankful every day for American democracy. My father came here and fled the pogroms and fled terrible violence, and his home was blown up, and he came here with nothing, and I ended up as a senior advisor to the President of the United States. And I'm grateful every day for American democracy and the safeguards, and so I'm passionate about it. But I'm also I know that so long as a party can be depicted as a party of elites and institutions at a time when people are enraged about elites and institutions, they're gonna have a hard time winning. And you can, in a democracy, if we respect democracy, then ultimately the people have the final say. So
totally agree.
All right, well, let's end there because
totally
I want
agree.
to, as long as we agree.
You're the political guy. How do I get to be the defender of the Democratic Party? I'm the defender of the rule of law, our rights, the fact that all of us are human beings of equal value and worth, and we all deserve dignity and respect, and I think a fair shake. That's all I care about.
Okay. Well.
So we agree on that.
We agree on a lot of things. It's just a matter of nuance. So anyway, Susan Rice, you thank you for this.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for a lifetime of service to the country as well.